Perek Hey of Hilchos Teshuvah, and the Rambam introduces the very important concept of Bechira, that every human being has the koach to choose good or evil. And there are then 4 questions, like the Seder, that the Rambam deals with in the issue of Bechira. We looked at 2 of them yesterday, just to repeat very, very quickly. Question number 1 is, how can Bechira exist? Because that posits that a human being can do something that's against the will of God. Does God want me to violate Shabbos? No. Can I violate Shabbos? Yes. If you posit there's something called Bechira, that's saying I can do something that God does not want me to do. So that can't be. That's logically incoherent. So we have to assume that God predetermines whatever it is that I do. So on that, the Rambam's answer is that this is folded into the will of Hashem. It's true, Hashem does not want you to actually violate Shabbos. But Hashem wants you to have the ability to violate Shabbos. And therefore, on a higher level, your capacity to rebel against Him is part of what He wants. And the logic of that is because that is the only way your goodness is good. Your goodness is good only if you had the ability to go the other way. Otherwise, it's just automatic pilot. So that's question number 1. Question number 2 is the old question that many people ask all the time, but the Rambam raises the question, and that is, if God knows the future, then God knew 1 trillion years ago if you were to learn good today or not. Then how can you realistically have a choice if your future decision is already known? And the Rambam's own answer is not really an answer. The Rambam's own answer is this is an unknowable problem, simply because God's knowledge is the same as God's essence, because God is an indivisible unity. And therefore, the same way we don't understand God's essence, we don't understand how God's knowledge intersects with human autonomy. And therefore, the Rambam says it's an unanswerable question. The Ravid was annoyed with that. Other people explain that the issue of knowledge foreclosing choice only exists when you're living in a temporal sequence of past, present, future. But if God is above time, God is simply observing the future like we observe the present moment. And the same way, if I observe your present moment, I'm not interfering with your choice. God is not interfering with your choice. He is simply observing your choice, albeit in the indefinite future. Okay. So those were the 2 questions we looked at briefly. Now the next 2 questions, question 3 and 4, are textual questions. And the first is from the Bris Bein Absarim, which is actually this week's Parsha, that if you recall, Avraham Avinu had a vision. He was told to cut up some animals, and it was a very scary vision. It became dark all of a sudden, and Avram went into a deep sleep. And God says to him, Yadoa Teda, you must surely know, Ki ger yeh zaracha b'eretz lo lahem. Your children or your descendants shall be strangers in a land that is not theirs. V'yavadum, and they will be slaves. V'inu osam, and they will be afflicted. Arba meos shana, for 400 years. Note the 3 words, they're actually very important. They will be strangers, avdos, gerus, avdos, they will be slaves, inoi, they will be afflicted, physically tortured, in a land that is not theirs. But then it says, and it says 400 years. Well, we'll talk about that. The Rambam does not address the fact we were not in Egypt. First of all, we were not in Egypt 400 years. From the time of Yaakov Avinu bringing the 70 people down to Mitzrayim until we left Mitzrayim was only 210 years. We were not there 400 years. Okay, we'll leave that aside. That is a question, and just for your knowledge, we'll talk about it, but the Rambam is not interested in that question right now. So you'll be a stranger, you'll be enslaved, you will be afflicted 400 years. But then it says, V'gam es hagoy asher yavodu. The nation that they work for, that they are enslaved to, Dan anochi, I will judge. I will punish them for all that they've done to you. V'yacharei kain, and after that punishment, Yetzu, your children shall leave, Birchush gadol, with great wealth. Now, on the most basic level, you understand how this is really a prophecy of what happens in Egypt. The Egyptians enslave us, the Egyptians afflict us, God judges them through the process of the plagues, and then we leave with great wealth, which is the gold and the silver that we took out of Mitzrayim. So this actually encapsulates the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, B'kitzer. But here's the Rambam's problem. The Rambam made the argument that free will is the necessary prerequisite for reward and punishment. You can't have a reward and punishment system without free will, because why should a person be accountable for doing bad things if they're doing bad things because God made them do those bad things? And therefore the Rambam's argument was, logically, the Torah must espouse the notion of autonomy, free will, accountability, responsibility, because that is implicit in a reward and punishment system. So frek the Rambam, how could God punish the Egyptians for enslaving the Jewish people if God decreed that this is going to happen? If God decreed that the Jewish people are going to be enslaved and persecuted, then there was no free will not to do that. That was God's decree. So if it was God's decree, how could the Egyptians be punished since they didn't have free will? Now please do not confuse this with question number 4, which we didn't get to yet, about Hashem hardening Paro's heart. That is not this question. And in fact, you will see that his answer to this question does not answer that question. We're going to have another answer to that question. This is not asking God hardening Paro's heart. This is asking from the Brisbane Upsarim. There is no free will, because God decreed we are to be enslaved. So here's the Rambam's interesting answer. It is true that God decreed that we be enslaved. And that was going to happen one way or the other. That couldn't be stopped. That would have to happen. But God did not decree who the enslavers would be. Right? Look at the pasuk. God simply decreed, your children will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. They will be enslaved. They will be persecuted 400 years. And the nation that enslaves them, I will judge. Didn't have to be Egypt. If we ask, did God force any Egyptian, Paro or any Egyptian, to enslave or persecute the Jewish people? The answer is he did not. Now it's true that if the Egyptians wouldn't have done it, it would have happened somewhere else. But that's simply, I think someone mentioned yesterday the analogy of God as a chess grandmaster, which is a very, very good analogy. What a grandmaster in chess can do is, every single move you make can be turned and co-opted towards his advantage. God has a plan. God's plan is the Jewish people, for whatever the reason, that's another discussion, have to go through a slavery experience. But God is not forcing any human being to be the bad guy. That's a matter of their free will. It happens to be, whichever one makes the choice, God will turn that choice to the advancement of his ultimate plan. But that does not take away the choice. Okay, and the truth of the matter is, this answer is an answer to many, many things. Did God decree the Holocaust? Did God decree that 6 million Jews died? Again, for whatever reason, I'm not here to give you reasons. The short answer is, he must have decreed it, otherwise it wouldn't have happened. So why is Hitler responsible? Why are Nazis responsible? Because God didn't decree that they would do it. Meaning to say, God has a certain result, and then God kind of waits to see which human beings are going to make the evil choices to carry out that result. And if they wouldn't have done it, someone else would have done it. So the Rambam's answer, therefore, is, even though the evils that befall Am Yisrael are decreed by God, they don't let the bad guy off the hook. Because the bad guy still remains a free agent. Yeah.
After every city did it, for the next nation, would Hashem make it a easier decision? Like, for example, like a more logical decision to enslave the Jews, like every progressive time, because they have to happen eventually? Well,
yeah, of course God knows the future, but you're asking the theoretical question, what if God is running out of options? Meaning to say, for some reason, none of the nations are enslaving the Jewish people. And, God's running out of nations. Like, what's going to happen? I don't know. It's a good question. Presumably, God might create the conditions where it's more likely that somebody would step forward in a bad way. Yeah.
For the Nazis, it wasn't there's a svara that they use, like Hashem, for one reason or another, might have given them that svara.
Yeah.
Are they more or less responsible for that svara?
That's a good question. I again, these are very hard questions. I'm assuming what would happen would be that God wouldn't give them the svara, the justification, the philosophical background, unless God saw in their heart that this is what they really want to do. Meaning God would not take a totally innocent person and implant these inclinations in their mind because he has a plan to carry out. But if God sees that they have the ratzon to do the bad thing, he'll open up avenues where they'll justify it. And you are correct. Obviously, even though it seems contradictory, but Nazism was based on a certain, a distorted philosophy, but it was based on a philosophy. They had arguments in favor of what they were doing, yeah.
Earlier in the Parsha, before Abraham had the dream that his descendants would be enslaved, not specifying which nation.
Yeah.
He talks about Abraham and Sarah. There's a famine. They go down to Egypt. There's it patterns the exact plot of, and then they leave with lots of wealth.
Yeah.
It patterns the exact plot. So what was kind of the point of that, and why did it happen before the dream instead of after?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. When Abraham went down to Mitzrayim in famine and left with great wealth, the Ramban, not the Rambam, the Ramban says Hashem is giving a foreshadowing of Mitzrayim, which indicates that Mitzrayim was in the cards. I don't know if the Rambam would agree with that analysis. The Rambam might not give any significance to Mitzrayim in terms of connecting it to the story, but that's a good ha'ara. So this is how the Rambam disassociates the consequence from the actor. The negative consequences, slavery, death, Holocaust, God decrees. Again, for reasons we don't really know, but God decrees. But God does not decree who is the bad actor that's going to do it. And therefore, there is still room in that world, that universe, for free will. That's the Rambam's answer to how God could hold the Egyptians accountable for carrying out his decree. Now, Ramban, in his Perush ala Torah, this week's Parsha, brings the Rambam in Hilchos Teshuvah, brings the Rambam's explanation to how could Hashem punish the Egyptians, And the Ramban doesn't like it, because the Ramban raises the question, well, Hashem decreed we would be slaves, but the Egyptians had free will not to enslave us. But Lamaisa, when they do enslave us, they're carrying out the will of God. So why should they be punished for carrying out the will of God? Now, I do want to point out that this is asking a good question, but it's not the question the Rambam was asking, meaning you have to differentiate between what the Rambam was bothered with and what the Ramban was bothered with. The Rambam was bothered with the idea that if something is a divine decree, you no longer have choice in the matter. On that, the Rambam's answer is a very good answer. You do have choice, because there was never a decree that you would be the guy to carry it out. That's the Rambam's problem. The Rambam had a problem with free will. Ramban is raising a moral issue. Okay, the Egyptians had free will, but they're doing the will of God. Because if God decreed that we be enslaved, they're doing what God wanted. If God didn't want it, it wouldn't have happened. Now that's a different question. In other words, that's not addressing free will. The Ramban's question is accepting they had free will, but they're doing the Ratzon Hashem. So that's a different question. And the Ramban gives two answers to this. Both answers are interesting chidushim. Answer number one is that motivation is very important here. And that is, yes, God decreed that the Jewish people be enslaved. Or we could even say, although I can't say for sure, God decreed 6 million Jews died. Is that why Paro enslaved us? Is that why Hitler murdered us? Meaning, was their motivation to carry out the will of God? Or was their motivation for their own selfish purposes? So Ramban says, even if it's true that the evil consequences were the will of God, the perpetrator is still going to be responsible if that is not their motivation. Now that's an interesting chiddush. I mean, that means theoretically, if somebody enslaved the Jewish people because they were very, very God-fearing and very, very Haredi, etc., and they said, this is the will of God, theoretically, according to Ramban, that might be justifiable. But the Ramban says motivation is very important here. And the second answer he gives is even more problematical. Yes, God decreed there would be slavery, but they went beyond. They did more than God decreed. Right? Slavery could take different forms. You know, slavery could mean similar to, I tell people, if you feel like stealing a car or, and putting yourself at risk of going to jail, so do it in Scandinavia, do it in Norway or Sweden, because if you have to go to jail, putting aside the Torah sister of Geneva, if you have to go to jail, Sweden is a really nice place to do it, because essentially you're in jail like, you can get to go to work or get to go to town from 9 to 5, and you can keep your car, but you just got to be back by 5. So, yeah, you're serving a prison sentence, but, come on, not so bad, so to speak. Well, it probably is, but, it's much, much better than, doing it in Turkey or whatever, or even doing it in Israel, for that matter. So slavery could take different forms. God's decree could have been satisfied with very little. The Egyptians did more than was necessary to effectuate the divine decree, and therefore they're accountable for the more, for the excess. Now I got two big problems with Ramban's second answer. Problem number one is, how does one know? God decreed the Jewish people be enslaved. I'm the enslaver. Well, how do I know that God meant a 5-point slavery and I did a 10-point slavery? How do you know? It's like God pulling, telling you after the fact, oh, no, I didn't mean it to be that bad. How do you know? The second problem I have with Ramban is, wait a second, God decreed it should be X, and they did 2X. Huh? So they could do more than God decreed? In other words, are you telling me the Egyptians were able to harm the Jewish people beyond the parameters of the divine decree? That extra was not the will of God? We will come back to this. This is a difficult question. It says, God only decreed X, and they did 2X. If God only decreed X, how could they do 2X? So these are two problems with the Ramban. Problem number one is, how does the oppressor know? And problem number two is, how does the oppressor get away? I mean, according to this, let's say the Holocaust, for example. Oh, maybe God decreed that Jews would die, but God decreed 1,000 Jews would die, and he killed 6 million. Well, if God only wanted 1,000 Jews to die, then how could he kill the other 6 million, or the difference? We'll come back to this. This is a really, really, really difficult question, but these are the two answers that the Ramban gives. How does the evildoer get away? Why is the evildoer responsible if he's carrying out a divine decree? Answer number one is, what is his motivation? Answer number two is, he's gone beyond the parameters of the decree. And as I say, that second answer in particular has some difficulties to it. Yeah.
How would that work for something like radical Islam, where they think they're serving God, and they think that by killing Jews, and perhaps there is a decree for some Jews to die. How do you figure it out?
Yeah. So that's a good question, but again, that's a different question. Meaning the question the Ramban is grappling with is, when God genuinely made a decree, how could you be punished for carrying out? Right? That's the Ramban's problem, and that actually is a bigger problem because God decreed it. Now you're raising the question of people who believe that God is commanding something, and they're in error. So there are a few approaches. I mean, one approach might be that indeed, had they had a good set of morality, they would not have been misled into that, meaning they are accountable for those false beliefs, or there is a possibility that maybe they are less accountable, but the ones who taught them that, the one who brainwashed them, may be accountable. I mean, this is actually a very difficult question. When you have kids who are brainwashed from, nursery school, that killing Jews and even torturing them is like a mitzvah, God forbid, it's a good deed, a virtue, it will get you into paradise. The question actually is, so we say, well, these are evil people. Well, are brainwashed people necessarily evil people? It's a hard question. Now, that doesn't mean you don't fight them, and it doesn't mean you don't kill them. That's a separate thing, because they're a threat. I mean, the same way you would kill a rabid dog with rabies. It's not the dog's fault, but, it's a danger. You got to get rid of it. So I'm not suggesting that we would change anything that we do, because we have to do what we have to do, but in terms of how Hashem judges them, it is a very, very interesting question. I mean, it must be the case that Hashem judges a brainwashed person with some degree of leniency different than a person who intentionally knows they're doing evil. So it's a very, very hard issue, unless you go with the idea that they should have, it's hard to say, they should have known better. This idea that you should have known better is an interesting idea. There's one of the Gaonim, Rabbi Nissim Gaon. Actually, we have fragments of his commentary. If you look at Maseches Brachos, look at a Gemara, beginning of Brachos. So you see on the side, for a few dafim, not for most of the Masechta, something called Rabbi Nissim Gaon. And this is a fragmentary. This was a parish that was much, much earlier than Rashi. And presumably it covered much more than we have, but we only have little fragments. But in the Hakdama, but interestingly enough, although the commentary itself is very fragmentary, we actually have an introduction in the Vilna Shas. Before Daf Beis, there is a Hakdama from Rabbi Nissim Gaon. The concept of a Hakdama was very unusual. Rashi, for example, did not write a Hakdama. Ramban did, but Rashi did not. Tosfos does not. But Rabbi Nissim Gaon wrote a Hakdama to his Perush al Shas. And in the middle of the Hakdama, he makes a very fascinating point. He raises the question that in the book of Yecheskel, where Yecheskel is describing how the Jewish people before the Churban are as bad as Sodom and Amorah. And it mentions the sins of Sodom and Amorah. And interestingly, in the book of Yecheskel, it does not mention sodomy, homosexuality. It doesn't mention that, although other Chazals do. In the Navi Yecheskel, it mentions selfishness, stinginess, not having compassion for the poor, not having rachamim. They were destroyed because of their cruelty and lack of rachmanus. That's what the Navi Yecheskel says. So Rav Nissim Gaon asks an interesting question. The people of Sodom are Goyim. They're not Jewish. Goyim are only obligated in the 7 mitzvahs of Noach. And if they violate those laws, they'll be punished for them. Giving tzedakah and having compassion for the poor is not one of the 7 mitzvahs of Noach. So how could Hashem destroy Sodom for not caring about the poor if it's not one of the 7 mitzvahs for which they're commanded? This is Reb Nissim Gaon's kasha. And he gives a very, very amazing and interesting answer. He says, there are some things in life you're supposed to figure out. God doesn't have to tell you. A decent human being understands that you help people that are in need. Of course, my kasha is, a decent human being also understands not to murder. I mean, so why was murder given in the 7 commandments of Noah? Okay, that's a kasha. But at least on the tzedakah, Rabbi Nissim Gaon says, a ben Noach is accountable not only for what God specifically said, but he's accountable for what he should have figured out. For the more philosophically oriented of you, or the more those that have a legal background, this is essentially an enshrinement within the Jewish religion of what is called natural law. Natural law is an idea that certain ideas are self-evident. They don't need to be legislated, either by man or by God. They don't need to be commanded. They are to be self-understood. And Rav Nissim Gaon says, Sodom was destroyed because of failure to carry out self-understood aspects of morality. The reason why I think the Rav Nissim Gaon might be relevant, possibly, to Hamas or the Palestinian terrorism is perhaps there's a similar type of calculation that only God can make, really. Only Hashem can determine the accountability, that certain things are so self-evident that a moral person would figure them out. So it's a chiddush. It is a chiddush. Rav Nissim Gaon is a chiddush, but that might be an explanation in some of these cases. Yeah.
Do you think that concept is searching for Jews?
So Rav Kook has a whole arichos that it definitely does apply to Jews, and in fact, this is one of the, this is going to be again a very controversial aspect of Rav Kook's teaching. Rav Kook, again, I need to emphasize, Rav Kook was an enormous Talmid Chacham, a Gadol B'Torah, a person who knew Bavli, Yerushalmi, Shulchan Aruch, Rambam, Tur, who knew, besides Kabbalah, Kol Torah Kula, so he was not mezalzel in the importance of Torah learning. Okay, I have to say that over and over again. But he made a point, this is yet another of his controversial points, that sometimes when we preoccupy ourselves with the great subtleties of Talmudic learning and we make such fine distinctions, we lose sight of a general morality that maybe even an average person might have, and we kind of lose it because we're involved in all sorts of chilukim. And he said that although obviously Talmud Torah, we have to do this, but we also have to be cautious not to lose the general morality that a righteous person should have. I mean, this comes up a lot in the way we deal with non-Jews. You know, people always have different schemes which involve cheating in one way or the other. So you ask a guy, let's say who's learning in yeshiva, well, am I allowed to pull this shtick? So the person will immediately start being mefalpel in the different sugyas of gezel akum, etc., and make chilukim, and like this rishon, yeah, and like that rishon, no. Rav Kook is saying, although in the olam of lamdus we need to be aware of all of these ramifications, but in the practical olam of maisa, we have to ask ourselves the question, is this yashras? Is this decent? Is this moral? Is this good? And Rav Kook said, again, very controversial, I'm asking him, I may get in trouble for this, but Rav Kook said that sometimes when you're overly involved in the trees, or the leaves, or the tiny branches, you lose sight of the overall forest. So yeah, this is where natural morality comes in. Now, of course, you got to be careful of the opposite, though, because sometimes what we think is natural morality might pervert our submission to Torah. For example, I'll give you an example again. I'll get in trouble. Let's say gay marriage, right? So you're going to hear people say, sometimes even Orthodox Jews, at least to the left, say, you know, all right, the Torah says, you know, homosexual expression is wrong, but how can you stand in the way of love? How can you stand in the way of not giving two people a chance to build a home? Where's your morality? Where's your compassion? Where's your ethics? Now that's the opposite of Rav Kook's problem. Rav Kook's problem was sometimes my preoccupation with subtlety may obscure a good natural morality. But I'm warning you that the opposite can be a problem too. Sometimes we embrace conventional, Western, New York Times morality, like it is the Ratzon Hashem, and we disregard halacha. So you can't win, really. Basically, you're sticking too much to the halachic detail. You know, you lose your moral compass. But you look at your own moral compass, and it becomes a hefker in which everything goes, and you're no longer meshuvah to the Ratzon Hashem. So you got to kind of do both things at the same time, but it's a difficult road to navigate. But you understand this idea that when someone is spending too much time justifying how they can cheat goyim, there is something makul kal. And by the way, and then they'll extend it to, oh, by the way, a Jew who doesn't keep Shabbos is like a guy. They'll extend it to that. And by the way, a Jew who wears kippah serugah is like a guy. Whatever it is. Once you start making those distinctions, there is something makul kal in the morality. I mean, would Reb Moshe Feinstein cheat a non-Jew? Now, I can't tell you for sure because I am not aware of any particular case, but I'm pretty confident he wouldn't, right? In spite of the fact that he certainly knows all of the ins and outs of this particular sugya. Okay, so this is where natural morality comes in, and it may have relevance with terrorists and the like. It's a difficult thing, but you know, ask yourself always, like, what type of person does Hashem want me to be? And if I do this type of behavior, am I acting like the person Hashem wants me to be? Or am I acting not like the person Hashem wants me to be? So halacha, in that sense, is your starting point, but it's not your ending point. Right? Halacha is your minimum. Halacha is your floor. It is not your ceiling. Okay? And that's one way. In fact, that's why the concept of lifnim mishur etadin, going beyond the letter of the law, is such an important part of halacha itself, because halacha creates the minimum structure, and then you have to aspire to be a more godly person within the framework of that halacha. Okay, so this is Rambam and Ramban on the bris bein apsarim Now, the fourth question, which I guess we'll talk about more tomorrow, I'll just start it, is the specific issue of Hashem hardening Paro's heart. Right? There are makos. Right? The blood and the frogs, everything else. And each time Moshe Rabbeinu gives warning and he says, let my people go, send them forth. And if not, this will happen, and this will happen, and this will happen. And it happens. And the Torah says, and God hardened Paro's heart, and he did not send forth the people. Now here the Rambam is bothered, as everyone is bothered, with the idea that this implies that Paro would have let the people go much earlier, but God wanted to stretch this out to show his miracles, to show his power, to show his might. So he literally made Paro to be stubborn, more stubborn than he would have been, and not release the people. Now here, you don't have the Rambam's answer to the Bris Bein Absarim. By the Bris Bein Absarim, the Rambam's answer was, Hashem did not interfere with the free will of any individual. So on the enslavement, the Egyptians decided on their own. But in this fourth question, Hashem hardened Paro's heart. Here, you are clearly dealing with interference of an individual. Right? The Rambam's answer to the Bris Bein Absarim is not going to be an answer to Hashem hardening Paro's heart. And Paro is getting punished. The Egyptians are getting punished. If God took away his ability to give in, which he would have done otherwise. So here, the Rambam develops a very, very interesting idea. And it starts off with the point that Hashem hardening Paro's heart only appears after the first 5 plagues. Meaning the first 5 plagues, Dam, the blood and the frogs and the lice, the wild animals, the boils, the first 5 plagues. It says Paro hardened his heart and did not send out the people. So this notion of God interfering was not at the outset. 5 plagues. Paro was given the opportunity to let them go. He did not. It's only in the latter half where it says Hashem hardened Paro's heart. So why is that significant? So the Rambam says we know that God has a system of reward and punishment. And punishment can take many, many forms. It could take Olam Haba, Gehenna. It can mean death. It can mean illness. It can mean poverty. It can mean loss of limb or loss of function. I'm not suggesting that it's only because of punishment, but when there is punishment, punishment can take any of these forms. And we can't really know why Hashem chooses one form of punishment rather than another form. We don't know. But presumably there's some level of higher divine wisdom why an onesh takes a specific form. So here's what the Rambam says. The same way a punishment might involve a loss of arm, or a loss of leg, or a loss of limb, or a loss of eyesight, there may be a punishment where because of a person's habitual, volitional sin, they lose the ability to have free will, meaning Hashem takes away from them the koach to do teshuvah. Meaning the punishment is you lose your free will and you will not do teshuvah. But that is a punishment for all of the averos that you did when you had free will. So here is the thing. After Paro defied Hashem once, twice, third time, fourth time, fifth time, and in the normal course of events, what would have happened is the Makos would have weakened his will, and he would have done Teshuvah. That's what would have happened normally. God says, his punishment is, I will take away his capacity to do teshuvah by removing his free will. But now here's the subtlety. He's not getting punished for that. In other words, the plague 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 are not punishments because of his refusal of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Well, actually 10 he agreed. It's a punishment for 1 to 5. And God is stretching it out, so he's not going to do teshuvah on it. In other words, you're only punished for the averos for which you had bechira. But Hashem may take away your ability to do teshuvah, so he can continue to punish you for those averos. So the Egyptians and Paro were not punished for what they did after they lost their bechira, but losing their bechira enables Hashem to continue punishing them for the sins they committed earlier in a volitional state. And then the Rambam says, well, why did God stretch it out then? I mean, if God is punishing them for the first 5, let him give them everything then and take the Jews out. So the Rambam says Hashem wanted to stretch out the process of punishment so the world would see over and over and over and over again the omnipotence of God, the might of God, the power of God, and therefore he stretched it out. But it is essentially payment for 1 to 5. All of the onshim are payment for 1 to 5, even the onshim that came 6 through 10. Yeah.
Does Hashem also harden the hearts of all the Egyptians? Or just,
Yeah, so that's a good question. The Chumash does not say he hardened the hearts of the Egyptians. It does not say, you're not going to find those words. And in fact, there were times where the Egyptians themselves, or some of them, said to Paro, let him go already, let him go already. And it says, Hashem hardened Paro's heart. So the interesting question that you're raising is, why should the Egyptians be punished? But the truth of the matter is, this answers that question too. Because for the first 5 Makos, the Egyptians were co-conspirators with Paro on everything. If that's the case, if all of the punishments later are because of the first 5 Makos, then it makes sense that the Egyptians will also get punished for that. You see, it's not a problem anymore. Okay, we'll talk about this some more, but this is the Rambam's interesting point, that sometimes the onish can be, you lose your bechira, so therefore you're not going to be able to do teshuvah. Now the question still becomes, is that absolute, or does that just mean it's harder? Meaning, when it says, just reading, when it says Hashem hardened the Paro's heart, does that mean there was no possible way? It's like Paro was given a weight of, 12 million tons. It was impossible? Or does it just mean Hashem gave him a certain stubbornness, which theoretically might have been overcome? Many learn, the Rambam doesn't address it beferish. The Rambam's lashon is mashma, Paro lost his bechira legamrei. But others say you don't have to say that necessarily. Rather, as opposed to the notion of God facilitating our teshuvah, Hashem gave Paro this stubbornness, which was a force within him that would take a great deal of effort to overcome, but was nonetheless not impossible to overcome. So that's another question of what exactly does it mean Hashem hardened Paro's heart. Okay, see you tomorrow. Be well.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.